There is a palace in Oxfordshire that cost a war hero everything he had and more. Blenheim Palace sprawls across 2,100 acres of English countryside, its honey-colored limestone walls stretching 856 feet along a facade designed to celebrate military victory. When construction began in 1705, it was meant to be a gift from a grateful nation to the man who had saved England from French domination. Parliament voted to build the palace at public expense as a reward for winning the Battle of Blenheim, the decisive victory that turned the War of Spanish Succession. The building would cost approximately £300,000, equivalent to roughly 60 to 70 million pounds in today's currency. It would contain 200 rooms arranged around courtyards in the Spanish manner. It would be called a palace, the only non-royal, non-episcopal building in England permitted that title, and it would bankrupt the man it was meant to honor. The Duke of Marlborough died in 1722, 3 years after finally moving into the unfinished palace. His fortune consumed by construction costs that Parliament had promised to pay, but never did. More than a century later, the palace was saved from collapse by an American heiress whose mother forced her into marriage with the Ninth Duke of Marlborough through emotional manipulation that Consuelo Vanderbilt herself would later describe as coercion. Her £2.5 million dowry, approximately £300 million today, restored the crumbling palace and established a pattern that continues to this moment. Blenheim Palace survives not through aristocratic wealth or government funding, but through desperate measures taken by people who inherited a burden disguised as a treasure. In 1705, when the first stones were laid, this land was something else entirely. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by stories of power, money, and the secrets hidden behind gilded walls, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Chapter 1. Vanbrugh's Impossible Commission. On the 13th of August, 1704, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, commanded a combined British, Dutch, and Austrian army of 52,000 men against a French and Bavarian force of 60,000 near the village of Blenheim on the Danube River. The battle lasted 12 hours. When it ended, French dominance of continental Europe had been shattered. Marlborough had saved the Grand Alliance from collapse and prevented Louis XIV from installing a French puppet on the Spanish throne. England, which had been a second-tier European power, now stood as the primary force preventing French hegemony. Parliament received news of the victory with euphoria that bordered on hysteria. Here was validation of England's military investment, proof that the nation could compete with continental powers, and a commander whose genius rivaled the great captains of antiquity. Members of Parliament immediately began discussing how to reward Marlborough. Cash grants seemed insufficient. Titles he already possessed. What the Duke needed, what England needed, was a permanent monument to the victory, something that would last centuries and remind future generations of the moment England became a true European power. Someone proposed that the nation build Marlborough a palace. The idea gained momentum rapidly. Queen Anne, who had made Marlborough a duke 2 years earlier and whose closest friend was Marlborough's wife Sarah, enthusiastically supported the plan. She would grant Marlborough the royal manor of Woodstock, 15,000 acres of crown land in Oxfordshire. Parliament would appropriate £240,000 to construct a palace on the site. The building would be named Blenheim, the English pronunciation of Blindheim, ensuring that the victory would never be forgotten. The arrangement seemed straightforward. Marlborough had delivered a historic military victory. The nation would deliver a historic palace. What Parliament did not anticipate was that historic palaces cost more than anyone budgets for, that political winds shift, and that promises made in euphoria are often abandoned in sobriety. In December of 1704, Marlborough began considering architects. The logical choice was Sir Christopher Wren, the 72-year-old architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, and dozens of London churches rebuilt after the Great Fire. Wren was England's most distinguished architect, a scientist and mathematician whose buildings combined classical proportions with English practicality. But Marlborough did not want practical. He wanted dramatic. He wanted a building that announced his importance the moment visitors saw it from miles away. He wanted architecture that felt like victory. Wren's churches were magnificent, but they were also restrained, designed to fit into urban contexts and serve religious functions. Marlborough needed something else. He needed theater. The man he chose had never designed a building in his life. Sir John Vanbrugh was 40 years old in 1705 when Marlborough commissioned him to design Blenheim Palace. He had been a soldier in his youth, serving in Flanders and briefly imprisoned in France on espionage charges. After his release, he had abandoned military life and become a playwright, writing comedies that scandalized London society with their sexual frankness. The Relapse and The Provoked Wife had made Vanbrugh famous and wealthy, but they had not made him an architect. That transformation occurred in 1699 when Vanbrugh convinced the Earl of Carlisle to let him design Castle Howard in Yorkshire. Vanbrugh had no training in architecture. He could not draw well. He had never studied engineering or structural mechanics. What he possessed was theatrical vision and the confidence of someone who had succeeded in one impossible career and saw no reason he could not succeed in another. Castle Howard, still under construction when Marlborough approached Vanbrugh, was already revealing itself as something extraordinary. The building was massive, theatrical, and consciously dramatic in ways that English architecture traditionally avoided. Vanbrugh designed buildings the way he wrote plays, with bold gestures and disregard for subtle convention. Marlborough saw Castle Howard and recognized what he wanted. Here was architecture that performed. Vanbrugh accepted the commission in early 1705. He brought with him Nicholas Hawksmoor, a 54-year-old architect who had spent decades as assistant to Christopher Wren and who possessed all the technical knowledge Vanbrugh lacked. Hawksmoor would provide structural engineering, detailed drawings, and practical solutions to construction problems. Vanbrugh would provide vision. Together they designed a palace in the English Baroque style, a theatrical interpretation of continental Baroque that remained rare in England. The building would be arranged around a massive central courtyard with symmetrical wings extending to north and south. The main facade would stretch 856 feet, longer than any private building in England. The central block would rise to 67 feet, topped with a massive pediment decorated with the Marlborough coat of arms. The entrance would be designed as a Roman triumphal arch, making explicit the connection between Marlborough's victories and Rome's conquering generals. Every decorative element would reference military triumph. Stone carvings would depict weapons, armor, and battle trophies. The roof would bristle with finials shaped like grenades and cannonballs. Even the landscaping, designed by Henry Wise, the royal gardener, would be laid out in patterns suggesting military formations. The building was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be overwhelming. Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, hated it immediately. Sarah was 55 years old in 1705, the daughter of impoverished gentry, who had risen to become Queen Anne's closest friend and most powerful advisor. She was fiercely intelligent, politically astute, and possessed of a legendary temper. She had married John Churchill when both were young and poor, and she had managed their finances with obsessive attention to detail for nearly 30 years. She understood that grand buildings cost grand sums, and she suspected that Vanbrugh's theatrical vision would cost more than Parliament had promised to pay. She argued for a more modest design, something elegant but practical, a house suitable for living rather than a monument suitable for impressing. Vanbrugh ignored her. Marlborough supported Vanbrugh. Construction began on the 18th of June, 1705. The site presented immediate challenges. The land at Woodstock was not flat. The River Glyme, a small stream, cut through the valley, requiring that a bridge be built to connect the palace to the northern sections of the park. Vanbrugh designed a bridge so massive that Sarah Churchill considered it absurd. The Grand Bridge would be 101 feet long and 31 feet high, spanning a stream barely 10 feet wide. Sarah called it a waste of money. Vanbrugh insisted it was essential to the composition. The scale of construction required an enormous workforce. At peak periods, 1,500 men worked on the site simultaneously. Stonemasons cut and shaped the Cornbrash limestone quarried from Tainton, about 18 miles away. Carpenters built scaffolding and roof structures from oak timber harvested in nearby forests. Laborers dug foundations in the marshy ground near the river and hauled materials across the site. Specialized craftsmen arrived to execute the decorative work. Louis Laguerre would paint ceilings and walls with elaborate murals. Sir James Thornhill would paint the ceiling of the Great Hall, depicting Marlborough kneeling before Britannia. The skilled workers received 12 to 18 pence per day. Laborers received less. All of them depended on regular wages paid from the parliamentary appropriation. By 1707, the main structure was beginning to rise. The walls glowed in afternoon light. The triumphal arch entrance took shape. The massive courtyard revealed its proportions. Visitors who came to observe the construction site were impressed by the scale and ambition. What Vanbrugh was building was not merely a house. It was a monument to one man's glory. And monuments, as Sarah Churchill would learn, cost far more than anyone planned to pay. Chapter 2. The Architect Who Couldn't Draw. Sir John Vanbrugh was not just unqualified to design England's largest non-royal palace, he was spectacularly unqualified. He had been born in 1664 in London, the son of a sugar merchant. His path to architecture had been so unlikely that even his contemporaries struggled to explain how a playwright with no formal training had convinced England's elite to trust him with their most important commissions. The answer had less to do with credentials than with personality. Vanbrugh possessed absolute confidence and the ability to articulate grand visions in ways that made them seem not just possible, but inevitable. He had learned to command attention as a playwright. His comedies had shocked London audiences with their sexual frankness and social satire, but they had also demonstrated his understanding of spectacle and drama. Theater trained him to think about space, movement, and visual impact. When he transitioned to architecture, he simply applied the same principles to buildings that he had applied to stage productions. Every structure should tell a story. Every space should create an emotional response. Every element should contribute to the overall effect. Castle Howard, his first architectural project, had begun as a collaboration with William Tallman, the official architect to the aristocracy. Tallman had produced conventional designs. The Earl of Carlisle had found them uninspiring. Vanbrugh had sketched something more ambitious, more theatrical, more expensive. Carlisle had taken the enormous risk of firing Tallman and hiring Vanbrugh despite his complete lack of experience. The decision had scandalized architectural circles, but Vanbrugh had delivered. Castle Howard was revolutionary, a palace that borrowed from continental Baroque traditions while remaining distinctly English in its scale and setting. Vanbrugh brought that same approach to Blenheim. He understood that Marlborough wanted more than a house. The Duke needed physical proof of his importance, a building that would justify his elevation from minor gentry to the highest ranks of English aristocracy. Military victories fade from public memory. Descendants forget what made their ancestors famous, but buildings endure. A sufficiently impressive palace ensures that future generations remember the man who built it, even if they forget why he mattered. Vanbrugh designed Blenheim to last and to dominate. The main facade would be visible for miles across the Oxfordshire countryside. The central block would rise high enough to function as a landmark. The scale would be impossible to ignore. This was architecture as propaganda, designed to announce that John Churchill had achieved greatness and that his descendants would inherit that status in perpetuity. Nicholas Hawksmoor made the vision structurally possible. Hawksmoor was 61 years old when work began at Blenheim, a lifetime spent solving architectural problems that more celebrated architects created. He had worked with Christopher Wren for decades, translating Wren's ideas into buildable structures. He did the same for Vanbrugh, calculating loads and stresses, designing foundations capable of supporting the massive weight, and ensuring that Vanbrugh's theatrical gestures would not collapse. The partnership worked because both men understood their roles. Vanbrugh created the vision. Hawksmoor made it stand. The design they produced together was unlike anything else in England. The central Great Hall would rise 67 feet high, lit by clear-story windows and topped with a painted ceiling depicting Marlborough's apotheosis. The staterooms would be arranged in the continental manner, a sequence of increasingly grand spaces designed to impress visitors with the Duke's wealth and taste. The long library, stretching 180 feet along the west wing, would be one of the longest rooms in any English private house. The saloon, positioned at the center of the south facade, would overlook formal gardens and provide views across the park. Every room was designed for display rather than comfort. The state apartments featured marble floors, elaborately carved woodwork, and painted ceilings. Furniture would be arranged to be admired rather than used. Visitors would be led through the sequence of rooms in a carefully choreographed procession designed to build to a climax in the saloon, where the Duke would receive guests beneath a ceiling depicting Britannia and the symbols of military victory. The palace was designed to function as a setting for the Duke's public performance of his status. Private comfort was secondary. The Duchess of Marlborough understood this and hated it. Sarah Churchill was fundamentally practical. She managed estates, tracked expenses, and ensured that properties generated income rather than consuming it. She looked at Vanbrugh's designs and saw money being wasted on theatrical gestures that served no functional purpose. Why did the entrance need to be a triumphal arch when a conventional doorway would suffice? Why did the bridge need to be 100 feet long to cross a 10-foot stream? Why did every surface need to be decorated with carved stone military trophies? Vanbrugh's response was that the building was not a house, it was a monument, and monuments required different standards. Sarah countered that monuments did not need to be lived in. She and the Duke would actually reside in this building, and Vanbrugh was designing it as if comfort and practicality were irrelevant. The tension between Duchess and architect would simmer for years before exploding into open warfare. But in the early construction years, Marlborough's support for Vanbrugh kept Sarah's objections contained. Construction proceeded rapidly in the early years. The foundations were laid by 1706. The main walls began rising in 1707. The roof structure took shape in 1708. Vanbrugh visited the site regularly, making adjustments to details and ensuring that the construction crews understood his intentions. Hawksmoor managed the technical aspects and supervised the craftsmen. Approximately 1,500 workers were employed on the site at peak periods, a massive workforce by the standards of the era. The coordination required was extraordinary. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, and transported to the site. Timber had to be harvested and seasoned. Lead for the roof had to be sourced from Derbyshire mines. Specialized craftsmen had to be recruited from across England and continental Europe. The logistics of feeding, housing, and managing 1,500 workers created their own challenges. Temporary structures were built on the site to house workers. Local farmers supplied food. Wages had to be paid on schedule or workers would abandon the project. The operation depended entirely on the regular flow of money from the parliamentary appropriation. As long as Parliament continued releasing funds, construction could continue. The building rising from the Oxfordshire landscape was unlike anything England had seen. The scale alone was remarkable. The use of Baroque theatrical devices was unexpected. The stone created a visual impact that seemed almost Mediterranean despite the English setting. Visitors to the construction site marveled at the ambition. Some wondered whether England really needed a palace that rivaled Versailles. Others argued that a nation ascending to great power status deserved architecture that reflected its importance. What no one anticipated was that within 5 years, the money would stop, the workers would abandon the site, and the building that was meant to glorify Marlborough would nearly destroy him. Chapter 3. Marlborough's Millions. John Churchill was born on the 26th of May, 1650, at Ashe in Devon, the son of Sir Winston Churchill, a royalist officer who had been impoverished by the English Civil War, and Elizabeth Drake, who claimed distant relation to Sir Francis Drake. The family belonged to the minor gentry, a social class that possessed titles but often lacked the money to support them. Sir Winston had fought for King Charles I during the Civil War, and his loyalty had cost him dearly. The victorious parliamentary forces had confiscated estates and imposed fines. By the time John was born, the family survived on what remained of diminished properties, and the hope that the restoration of the monarchy would restore their fortunes. The restoration came in 1660 when John was 10 years old. Charles II returned from exile, and royalist families expected rewards for their suffering. Sir Winston received little beyond symbolic recognition. The family remained poor. John's future depended on finding patronage, and his path to advancement opened through an unexpected source. His older sister Arabella became mistress to the Duke of York, the future King James II. Through that connection, John secured a position as page to the Duke of York in 1667 when he was 17 years old. Military service offered the most reliable path to advancement for younger sons of impoverished gentry. John received a commission as captain in the Foot Guards in 1672 at age 22. He served in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, fighting in the French army under the famous Marshal Turenne. He distinguished himself at the Siege of Maastricht in 1673, demonstrating the tactical intelligence and personal courage that would define his career. He learned that war was not just about bravery, but about logistics, supply lines, understanding terrain, and anticipating enemy movements. He rose through military ranks steadily through the 1670s and 1680s, earning a reputation as a competent officer and capable commander. His marriage in 1678 changed his trajectory more than his military service. He married Sarah Jennings in a secret ceremony on the 1st of October, 1678. The marriage was unusual for several reasons. Both were poor. Sarah had no dowry. John had no estate. Marriages among the gentry were typically arranged to consolidate wealth or establish political alliances. This marriage was a love match, rare for the era and risky for both parties. But Sarah brought something more valuable than money. She had become close friends with Princess Anne, daughter of the Duke of York. When Anne's father became King James II in 1685, and especially when Anne's sister Mary and her husband William of Orange took the throne in 1688, Sarah's friendship with Anne became a source of enormous political power. Anne trusted Sarah completely, relied on her advice, and refused to make important decisions without consulting her. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah became the power behind the throne, controlling access to the queen and wielding influence that made her one of the most powerful women in England. John Churchill's rise to the highest military command depended partly on his abilities and partly on his wife's relationship with the Queen. Anne made Churchill the Duke of Marlborough in 1702 when she ascended the throne. She appointed him Captain General of the British forces and Master General of the Ordnance. These positions came with substantial salaries and allowances, approximately £10,000 per year at their peak. But Churchill's wealth came from multiple sources. Military command brought prize money from captured enemy supplies and equipment. Political positions accumulated over decades provided income from various sinecures. The Queen granted him the royal manor of Woodstock, which generated approximately £6,000 annually in rents from tenant farmers. Parliament voted him grants after major victories, including a pension of £5,000 per year from royal revenues. Churchill and Sarah were also shrewd investors. They purchased government securities, acquired additional properties, and managed their holdings with obsessive attention to detail. Sarah, in particular, proved to be a financial genius, tracking every expense and ensuring that their wealth grew rather than dissipated. By 1705, when Parliament voted to build Blenheim Palace, Churchill was one of the wealthiest men in England, with a fortune estimated at £1 to £2 million, equivalent to approximately £200 to £400 million today. His wealth was not inherited. He had built it through military success, political maneuvering, and careful financial management over 35 years. He had accumulated titles: Earl of Marlborough in 1689, Marquess of Blandford in 1702, Duke of Marlborough in 1702, Prince of Mindelheim from the Holy Roman Emperor in 1704, Knight of the Garter in 1702. He owned properties including Marlborough House in London, designed by Christopher Wren and completed in 1711, and Holywell House in St. Albans, which served as his primary residence before Blenheim was ready. He commanded the respect of European leaders. Diplomats sought his favor. Artists painted his portrait. His military campaigns were studied by future generals. He had achieved everything a man born to minor gentry could hope to achieve. Except one thing: he had no male heir. His only son John, Marquess of Blandford, had died in 1703 at age 17 from smallpox. Churchill had 4 surviving daughters, but no son to inherit his titles and carry forward his legacy. The dukedom had been created with a special remainder allowing it to pass through the female line. ensuring that his titles would not die with him. But a dukedom without a direct male heir felt incomplete. The palace being built at Woodstock was meant to house a dynasty. Churchill was 65 years old when construction began. He understood his mortality. The palace was his attempt to ensure that his achievements would be remembered by generations of descendants who would live in the building and inherit the glory he had won. But glory is expensive. The palace Parliament promised to build was consuming money faster than Parliament was willing to release it. Churchill had sufficient wealth to complete the building if necessary, but doing so would consume the fortune he had spent a lifetime accumulating. He believed Parliament's promise that the nation would pay for the palace. Parliament had voted the funds. The appropriation existed. The money should flow. What Churchill did not fully anticipate was that political power is temporary, that parliamentary majorities shift, and that promises made by one government can be abandoned by the next. He had won every battle he fought during the War of Spanish Succession, but the palace being built in his honor would defeat him. Chapter 4. When Parliament stopped paying. In 1710, everything changed. The War of Spanish Succession had been dragging on for 8 years. England and its allies had won major victories, but the conflict continued without resolution. The English public, initially enthusiastic about military success, had grown weary of the costs. Taxes remained high to fund the war. Casualties mounted, and voices began questioning whether continued fighting served English interests or merely the ambitions of the general commanding the army. The Whig government that had supported Marlborough began losing political ground to the Tories, who campaigned on ending the war and reducing military spending. Elections in 1710 gave the Tories control of Parliament. The new government was hostile to Marlborough personally and opposed to the continued military commitment in Europe. Marlborough had always been politically flexible, changing allegiances when advantageous throughout his career. His enemies remembered every betrayal. The Tories, who took power in 1710, had scores to settle. They could not directly attack Marlborough's military record, but they could undermine him politically and financially. The attack came through Queen Anne. Sarah Churchill's friendship with the Queen had been the foundation of Marlborough's power for decades. But by 1710, that friendship was collapsing. Sarah was abrasive, demanding, and increasingly contemptuous of the Queen's limitations. She had served Anne faithfully for years, but had also treated the Queen as someone who needed constant guidance and correction. Anne had endured Sarah's domination because she valued their history together, but affection has limits. A new favorite emerged. Abigail Masham, a cousin of Sarah's, had been working in the Queen's household as a minor attendant. She was quiet where Sarah was loud, deferential where Sarah was demanding, and willing to listen rather than lecture. Anne found her restful. Sarah found her threatening. The relationship between Sarah and Anne deteriorated rapidly in 1710 and 1711. Sarah accused Anne of ingratitude. Anne accused Sarah of disrespect. What had been a friendship built over decades collapsed into mutual resentment. Marlborough tried to remain above the personal disputes, but his position depended on the Queen's favor, and the Queen's favor now belonged to someone else. The Tory government recognized the opportunity. In 1711, they began a campaign to remove Marlborough from power. Accusations circulated that he had profited excessively from army contracts, that he had prolonged the war for personal gain, that his military victories had been exaggerated. The charges were largely fabricated or exaggerated, but they created political cover for what the government wanted to do anyway. On the 31st of December, 1711, Marlborough was dismissed from all his offices. The man who had saved England from French domination, who had never lost a battle, who had been celebrated as the greatest general since Julius Caesar, was removed from power by a government that wanted peace and resented his success. The dismissal carried immediate financial consequences. Marlborough's salaries and allowances ceased, but more importantly, the flow of money to Blenheim Palace stopped. Parliament had appropriated £240,000 for the palace construction. By 1712, only £135,000 had been released. £105,000 remained unpaid. The Tory government had no intention of giving Marlborough another penny. Construction at Blenheim depended entirely on regular payments from the parliamentary appropriation. Workers expected wages every week. Suppliers needed payment for materials. The operation ran on credit, with everyone assuming that money would continue flowing from London. When the payments stopped, the entire system collapsed. Workers struck first. Masons, carpenters, and laborers, who had not been paid in weeks, abandoned the site. Suppliers refused to deliver materials until outstanding bills were settled. Craftsmen working on interior decoration packed their tools and left. By the end of 1712, Blenheim Palace stood partially completed, with walls rising to their full height, but interiors unfinished, the roof incomplete in sections, and scaffolding covering parts of the structure. The site was abandoned. Sarah Churchill was furious. She blamed Vanbrugh for designing a palace so expensive that Parliament had balked at paying for it. She blamed the Tory government for punishing her husband through the palace. She blamed the Queen for allowing the Tories to do it. Mostly, she blamed Vanbrugh. Sarah had never liked Vanbrugh's designs. Now she had proof that her instincts had been correct. His theatrical vision had produced a building so costly that it could not be completed. She began interfering directly in construction decisions, countermanding Vanbrugh's orders, and demanding cheaper alternatives to his designs. Vanbrugh tried to maintain control of the project, but without payment flowing, he had no leverage over workers or suppliers. His authority depended on being able to pay people. When the money stopped, so did his power. The relationship between Duchess and architect, never warm, deteriorated into open warfare. Sarah called Vanbrugh mad and incomprehensible. She accused him of wasting money on unnecessary decorative elements. She blamed him for the financial disaster the palace had become. Vanbrugh defended his designs and blamed Parliament for breaking its promise. The argument became so bitter that in 1716 Sarah effectively fired Vanbrugh. She banned him from the construction site, hired other architects to complete the work, and informed Vanbrugh that his services were no longer required. Vanbrugh was devastated. Blenheim was meant to be his masterpiece, the building that would establish his reputation for generations. He had spent years designing every detail, coordinating craftsmen, and fighting to preserve his vision against Sarah's demands for economy. To be expelled before completion felt like artistic murder. He wrote bitter letters complaining about Sarah's treatment. He argued that she had no understanding of architecture and no appreciation for what he was trying to achieve. Sarah responded that she understood money, and Vanbrugh had spent too much of it. The Duke of Marlborough tried to mediate, but lacked the energy or authority to impose solutions. He had suffered a stroke in 1716 that left him partially paralyzed. His speech was impaired. His political career was finished. He lived in exile in Europe for several years before being allowed to return to England in 1714 after Queen Anne died and George I took the throne. But the new king did not restore Marlborough to his former positions. The Duke was a celebrated relic, honored for past achievements, but no longer relevant to current politics. He and Sarah decided to complete Blenheim using their own money. They had spent decades accumulating wealth. That wealth would now be consumed by finishing the palace Parliament had promised to build. Sarah paid approximately £60,000 from their personal fortune to complete the interiors and make the palace habitable. She hired architects other than Vanbrugh to oversee the work. She made changes to Vanbrugh's designs wherever possible, removing decorative elements she considered wasteful and substituting cheaper alternatives. The palace that was eventually completed was not exactly what Vanbrugh had envisioned, but it was finished. The Duke and Duchess moved into Blenheim in 1719. The Duke was 69 years old, in declining health, and had only 3 years left to live. He had waited 14 years to occupy the palace that Parliament had voted to build as a reward for his military achievements. The palace had cost him his fortune, his wife's happiness, and any pleasure he might have taken in the achievement. He died on the 16th of June, 1722, at Windsor Lodge. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, though his body would later be moved to the chapel at Blenheim Palace. Sarah would live another 22 years as a widow. England's grateful gift to its greatest general had cost him everything. Parliament had promised a monument. What they delivered was a millstone. Chapter 5. The Widow's Palace. When the Duke of Marlborough died in 1722, Sarah Churchill became one of the wealthiest widows in England. She was 62 years old, in full possession of her mental faculties, and determined to finish what Parliament and her late husband had started. She would spend the next 22 years completing Blenheim Palace, fighting legal battles over unpaid construction costs, and ensuring that no one, especially not Sir John Vanbrugh, would take credit for her achievement. Sarah had always been the financial genius behind the Marlborough fortune. While her husband earned glory on battlefields and in political chambers, she had managed estates, tracked expenses, and invested their wealth with obsessive attention to detail. She understood property values, rental income, and compound interest in ways that most aristocrats considered beneath their dignity. The fortune the Duke left behind was substantial despite the costs of completing Blenheim. Sarah took control of it and managed it even more aggressively than before. She sold properties that generated insufficient income. She purchased government securities when terms were favorable. She fought every lawsuit, disputed every bill, and refused to pay anything she considered unjustified. Her reputation for parsimony became legendary. People told stories about the Duchess of Marlborough's refusal to pay tradesmen, her arguments with suppliers, and her insistence on reviewing every expense personally. Some stories were exaggerated, but the essential truth was accurate. Sarah controlled every penny that entered or left her possession. She applied that same ruthless efficiency to completing Blenheim. The palace was structurally complete when the Duke died, but interiors needed finishing. Decorative work remained undone, and numerous contractors claimed they were owed money for work performed years earlier. Sarah hired architects and craftsmen to complete the interiors according to her specifications, not Vanbrugh's. She made changes wherever possible, removing decorative elements she considered excessive and substituting simpler, cheaper alternatives. The long library, which Vanbrugh had designed as a picture gallery, she converted to a library because books seemed more practical than empty walls covered with paintings. She altered room layouts, changed wall coverings, and made the palace more livable according to her standards. What emerged was a palace that reflected both Vanbrugh's theatrical vision and Sarah's practical modifications, a compromise between architectural ambition and residential functionality. Sarah's greatest battles were legal rather than architectural. She sued the government repeatedly to recover the £105,000 that Parliament had appropriated but never released. The lawsuits dragged on for years. Sarah argued that Parliament had made a commitment and was obligated to honor it. The government argued that the appropriation had been conditional, that circumstances had changed, and that the Duke's dismissal from office had voided any obligation to continue payments. The courts generally sided with the government. Sarah won some smaller judgments, but never recovered the full amount she believed was owed. She spent thousands of pounds on legal fees, pursuing claims worth tens of thousands, but Sarah viewed the principle as more important than the accounting. Parliament had made a promise and broken it. She would not let that betrayal stand unchallenged, even if fighting it cost more than she could hope to recover. Her treatment of Vanbrugh revealed the depth of her bitterness. Vanbrugh had not received full payment for his architectural services. He submitted bills for work performed, including design fees and supervision costs. Sarah refused to pay. She argued that Vanbrugh had mismanaged the project, that his expensive designs had caused the financial crisis, and that he deserved nothing beyond what he had already received. Vanbrugh tried negotiating, then pleaded, then threatened legal action. Sarah ignored him. When Vanbrugh's friends tried to mediate, Sarah told them she would never pay Vanbrugh a single penny beyond what she had been legally compelled to provide. The dispute became personal in ways that transcended money. Vanbrugh had designed Blenheim as his masterpiece. Sarah treated him as a charlatan who had nearly bankrupted her family. When Blenheim was finally completed and Sarah held events at the palace, she explicitly banned Vanbrugh from attending. Even ceremonial functions celebrating the palace's completion were closed to the man who had designed it. The story circulated through London society. Everyone understood that Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, held grudges, and that crossing her carried permanent consequences. In 1726, Vanbrugh died at age 62, never having seen the completed palace he had spent years designing. Sarah, informed of his death, reportedly showed no emotion. The man who had created Blenheim's theatrical facade, its triumphal entrance, its massive bridge, and its Baroque flourishes, died knowing that the woman who controlled the palace despised him. Sarah would outlive him by 18 years. She spent those years finishing the palace interiors and managing the estates that provided income. Blenheim generated some revenue from tenant farms on the surrounding land. But maintaining a palace that size consumed money constantly. Roofs leaked, stone facades weathered and needed repair. Heating the massive structure through English winters required enormous quantities of firewood and coal. Staff had to be paid to maintain rooms that were rarely used. The palace that Parliament had promised to build as a gift had become a financial burden that would affect every future generation. Sarah understood this. She tried to ensure that future dukes would have sufficient income to maintain the property, but she also knew that circumstances could change. Agricultural income that seemed reliable in 1730 might disappear by 1760. She could only do so much to protect descendants from their own decisions. On the 18th of October, 1744, Sarah Churchill died at age 84. She had outlived her husband by 22 years, Queen Anne by 30 years, and Vanbrugh by 18 years. She left behind a completed palace, a substantial fortune, and a reputation for ruthless financial management that would be remembered for centuries. Her grandson inherited the dukedom in the palace. What he also inherited was the question that would haunt every subsequent duke. What does a family do with a monument that bankrupted its builder? For the next century, the answer would be survive in it, sometimes barely. Chapter 6. Capability, Brown's Revolution. By 1758, Blenheim had survived. The palace that had nearly bankrupted its builder stood complete, its limestone walls glowing across the Oxfordshire landscape. George Spencer, the fourth Duke of Marlborough, inherited the dukedom from his grandfather at age 19. He was wealthy, politically ambitious, and determined to make Blenheim function as it was originally intended. The palace would become the center of English political life, a gathering place for the Whig aristocracy, and the physical manifestation of the Spencer-Churchill family's importance. The fourth Duke possessed resources that the first Duke had lacked. He inherited substantial estates that generated reliable income. Agricultural prices were rising. The English economy was expanding. He could afford to invest in Blenheim without fear of bankruptcy. He married Lady Caroline Russell, daughter of the fourth Duke of Bedford, strengthening his connections to one of England's most powerful families. He served in various government positions, including Lord Privy Seal and Lord Chamberlain to King George III. He was everything an aristocratic duke should be: wealthy, connected, politically active, and committed to maintaining his family's status. But when he looked at Blenheim, he saw something wrong. The palace itself was magnificent, but the grounds were not. Henry Wise had designed formal Baroque gardens in the French style, geometric parterres arranged in military patterns that echoed the palace's martial themes. The River Glyme still flowed through a small valley, making Vanbrugh's massive bridge look absurd. The overall effect was continental, a piece of Versailles transplanted to England. The fourth Duke wanted something different. He wanted an English landscape. In 1764, the Duke hired Lancelot Brown, known throughout England as Capability Brown, for his habit of telling clients that their estates had capability for improvement. Brown was 48 years old and the most sought-after landscape designer in England. He had spent decades transforming formal gardens into naturalistic landscapes that looked as if nature had arranged them without human intervention. His style rejected the geometric rigidity of French Baroque gardens in favor of rolling lawns, irregular clumps of trees, and serpentine lakes that followed natural contours. Brown's landscapes were expensive. He charged substantial fees, and his projects required massive earthworks, years of planting, and ongoing maintenance. The fourth Duke could afford it. Brown studied the Blenheim estate and proposed a radical transformation. He would sweep away all of Henry Wise's formal Baroque gardens. Every geometric parterre, every military-themed planting arrangement, every formal element would be removed and replaced with naturalistic English landscape. Most dramatically, he would dam the River Glyme and create a massive serpentine lake in the valley. The lake would cover approximately 200 acres and transform the landscape from a small stream winding through a valley into a major water feature. And it would solve the problem of Vanbrugh's bridge. The Grand Bridge, which had seemed absurdly oversized when it spanned a 10-foot stream, would become perfectly proportioned when it crossed a lake. Duchess Sarah, dead for 20 years, would have been appalled. She had considered the bridge wasteful when built. The idea of spending thousands of pounds to dam a stream just to justify the bridge's scale would have seemed like madness. But the fourth Duke approved Brown's plan without hesitation. The work took 10 years, from 1764 to 1774. Brown's crew dug channels, built dams, moved thousands of cubic yards of earth, and planted hundreds of trees. The formal gardens disappeared beneath rolling lawns. Geometric arrangements gave way to carefully irregular clumps of trees positioned to create picturesque views from the palace windows. The Serpentine Lake filled slowly as the dam held back the River Gleim. When the project was complete, Blenheim had been transformed. The palace now sat in a landscape that looked ancient and natural, as if it had always been there. The Great Lake reflected the stone walls. Vanbrugh's bridge, perfectly scaled to the water it crossed, became one of the most photographed architectural elements in England. The grounds invited walking and contemplation, rather than formal promenades. Visitors who had known the old Baroque gardens marveled at the transformation. Some criticized Brown for destroying the original landscape. Others praised him for creating something better. The cost was approximately £21,000, equivalent to roughly £3.5 million today. The fourth Duke considered it money well spent. With the landscape transformed, Blenheim became what the first Duke had intended. The palace functioned as a political headquarters for the Whig Party. The fourth Duke hosted gatherings of politicians, diplomats, and intellectuals. Cabinet ministers stayed in the state apartments. Political strategy was debated in the saloon. The Polo Lounge did not exist yet, but conversations held at Blenheim during the fourth Duke's tenure shaped government policy and influenced parliamentary votes. The Duke employed approximately 200 to 250 servants to maintain the palace and grounds. The hierarchy of service was complex, with a house steward managing the indoor staff and a head gardener commanding 30 to 40 workers who maintained Brown's landscape. Meals were elaborate affairs with 8 to 12 courses served to 20 to 40 guests. The palace kitchens operated continuously to feed residents, guests, and staff. The social season brought a constant stream of visitors. Spring and autumn house parties lasted weeks, with guests hunting, fishing, walking the grounds, and attending elaborate dinners. Evenings featured music, cards, and conversation in the state rooms. The palace library accumulated thousands of volumes. Art collections grew as the Duke purchased paintings and sculpture. Blenheim was fulfilling its purpose as the seat of an important English family, a center of political power, and a monument to aristocratic grandeur. King George III visited in 1786, touring the palace and grounds with the fourth Duke serving as his Lord Chamberlain. The visit represented royal recognition of Blenheim's significance and the Spencer-Churchill family's importance to English society. For perhaps the only time in its history, Blenheim functioned exactly as its builders intended. It was the seat of power, the gathering place of influence, the physical manifestation of England's ruling class. The transformation was complete. Chapter 7. American Grain and English Ruin. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Dukes of Marlborough maintained Blenheim through the 19th century without matching the 4th Duke's achievements. They preserved the palace, managed the estates, and fulfilled their social obligations, but none possessed the 4th Duke's wealth or political influence. More importantly, the economic foundations of English aristocracy were eroding. The crisis began in the 1870s when American grain flooded British markets. Cheap grain from vast American farms transported by steamship across the Atlantic undersold British agricultural production. English tenant farmers who had paid rent from crop sales found themselves unable to compete. Rental income from agricultural estates plummeted. The aristocracy had depended on rental income for centuries. Estates that had generated thousands of pounds annually saw revenues cut in half. Some properties became unprofitable to maintain. The Depression lasted decades. By the 1890s, British agriculture had not recovered. American grain continued dominating markets. Australian wool undersold British production. Refrigerated shipping brought cheap meat from Argentina. Every traditional source of agricultural income faced competition from global markets that rewarded efficiency and scale. English estates, divided among tenant farmers working small plots with traditional methods, could not compete. Death duties compounded the problem. The government increased taxes on inherited estates, forcing families to sell property or art to pay what they owed. Each generation inherited less wealth than the previous one had possessed. The accumulation of capital that had sustained aristocratic families for centuries reversed. Families that had been wealthy for generations discovered they were merely rich. Families that had been rich discovered they were merely comfortable. And families that had been comfortable discovered they were sliding toward poverty. The 8th Duke of Marlborough died in 1892, leaving a financial disaster. The estate owed £12.5 million in accumulated debts, equivalent to approximately £1.5 billion today. Annual income from the estates was £37,000. Annual expenses exceeded £47,000, creating a £10,000 annual deficit. The palace itself was deteriorating. The roof leaked in multiple sections. Stone facades were crumbling. Damp and mold spread through parts of the building. Some rooms had become uninhabitable. Heating the palace through winter was prohibitively expensive, so sections remained closed and unheated for months. Staff wages had not been paid in full for months. Workers threatened to leave. Creditors demanded payment on outstanding bills. The family faced potential bankruptcy and forced sale of the estate. The Ninth Duke of Marlborough, Charles Richard John Spencer-Churchill, inherited this catastrophe at age 21. He was young, inexperienced, and utterly unprepared for the scale of the crisis. Financial advisors presented him with brutal arithmetic. The estate's income could not cover its expenses. The deficit would compound annually. Within a few years, the family would be forced to sell Blenheim to pay debts, or the government would seize the property for unpaid taxes. Selling art and furnishings might delay the crisis temporarily, but would not solve the fundamental problem. The palace cost more to maintain than it generated in income, and that equation would not change unless the Duke found a massive injection of capital. Some advisors suggested demolishing parts of the palace to reduce maintenance costs. Others proposed selling the entire property and moving the family to a smaller, more manageable house. The Ninth Duke refused both options. Blenheim was the family's heritage, the monument the first Duke had bankrupted himself to build, the palace that defined the Spencer-Churchill identity. Losing it would mean acknowledging that the family's 3 centuries of prominence had ended. He needed a solution that preserved Blenheim while solving the financial crisis. The solution existed across the Atlantic Ocean. In America, industrial fortunes had created a new class of wealth that dwarfed anything the English aristocracy possessed. Railroad barons, steel magnates, and banking families had accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars within a single generation. They had money but lacked something money alone could not buy: aristocratic status. The social elite of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia yearned for connection to European nobility. Daughters of American industrial families could not enter the upper reaches of American society, which remained dominated by old families who sneered at new wealth. But a daughter who married a European duke could transcend those limitations entirely. American mothers understood this arithmetic. They began traveling to Europe with daughters in tow, attending social events where impoverished aristocrats gathered, arranging introductions and negotiating marriage settlements. The transaction was explicit. The American family provided money. The European family provided a title. The daughter gained status. The aristocrat gained survival. The press called it cash for coronets, and by the 1890s it had become common enough that both sides approached negotiations with lawyers and accountants rather than romantic pretense. In the spring of 1893, the Ninth Duke of Marlborough boarded a ship for New York. He was 21 years old, deeply in debt, and in desperate need of money. What he was selling was a title. What he was buying was survival. Across the Atlantic, the richest families in America were shopping for something money alone could not buy. Chapter 8. The Prisoner Bride. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on the 2nd of March, 1877, in New York City, the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt. Her grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who had built the family's railroad fortune. By 1893, when the Ninth Duke of Marlborough arrived in New York, the Vanderbilt family was one of the wealthiest in America, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Consuelo was 18 years old, beautiful according to the standards of the era, well-educated, and utterly miserable about the future her mother was planning. Alva Vanderbilt had ambitions that her daughter's preferences could not be allowed to obstruct. Alva had married into wealth but remained excluded from the highest levels of New York society, which was controlled by old families like the Astors, who considered the Vanderbilts to be nouveau riche. Alva understood that her own social advancement was limited, but Consuelo could transcend those barriers entirely by marrying into European aristocracy. A duchess, even an American duchess, occupied a social position that old New York money could not match. Alva had been planning this strategy for years. She took Consuelo to Europe repeatedly, ensured she learned French and proper etiquette, and positioned her to meet eligible aristocrats. When the Ninth Duke of Marlborough arrived in New York in 1893, explicitly searching for a wealthy bride, Alva recognized the opportunity. The Duke was young, reasonably presentable, and possessed one of England's most famous titles. More importantly, he was desperate for money, which meant the negotiation could be concluded quickly. Consuelo had other plans. She was in love with Winthrop Rutherford, a handsome and charming American from an old New York family. Rutherford was not as wealthy as the Vanderbilts, but he was respectable, educated, and everything Consuelo wanted in a husband. She and Rutherford had an understanding. They planned to marry. When Consuelo told her mother about Rutherford, Alva forbade the relationship absolutely. She told Consuelo that marriage to an American, no matter how respectable, would be a waste of her potential. Consuelo protested. Alva threatened. The confrontation escalated over months. Consuelo refused to consider the Duke of Marlborough. Alva insisted. Rutherford tried to see Consuelo. Alva barred him from the house. Consuelo attempted to defy her mother. Alva employed emotional manipulation that Consuelo would later describe as psychological torture. The exact tactics remain disputed, but multiple sources, including Consuelo's autobiography written decades later, describe Alva threatening suicide if Consuelo refused the Duke. Whether Alva actually made such threats or merely implied them through hysterical behavior, the effect was the same. Consuelo, 18 years old and emotionally exhausted, concluded that defying her mother was impossible. She agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. The marriage settlement was negotiated with lawyers and financial advisors on both sides. The Vanderbilt family would provide £2.5 million in capital, equivalent to approximately £300 million, or $375 million today. The capital would be held in trust with the Duke receiving income but unable to access the principal. Additionally, the Vanderbilts would provide $100,000 annually, approximately £20,000, for Consuelo's personal expenses and the Duke's household costs. In return, Consuelo would become the Duchess of Marlborough with all privileges and status that title conveyed. The Duke would receive the capital and income he needed to save Blenheim Palace. The wedding took place on the 6th of November, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in New York City. 3,000 guests attended. The ceremony was the most publicized society event of the decade. Newspapers across America and England covered every detail. Reporters described Consuelo's wedding dress, the flowers, the guests, and the spectacle of an American heiress marrying into one of England's most famous families. What the newspapers also noted, because it was impossible to ignore, was that Consuelo cried throughout the ceremony. Witnesses reported that she appeared devastated rather than joyful. Her mother stood nearby, triumphant. The Duke, observing his bride's distress, showed no emotion. The press called it the sale of the century. The Duke had purchased survival for Blenheim Palace. Consuelo had purchased entry to English aristocracy. The price Consuelo paid was her freedom. The marriage was notoriously unhappy from the beginning. The Duke was cold, formal, and primarily interested in the money Consuelo had brought. Consuelo found Blenheim cold, damp, and uncomfortable. The palace that millions of dollars had restored remained a monument rather than a home. The massive staterooms were designed for display, not living. The private apartments were drafty and poorly heated. Staff were formal to the point of rigidity. English social customs felt alien and restrictive. Consuelo was lonely, homesick, and trapped in a marriage she had never wanted. The Duke made no effort to make her comfortable. He had obtained what he needed from the marriage. Her happiness was not his concern. The marriage produced two sons. John Albert Edward William Spencer-Churchill was born on the 13th of September, 1897. He would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. Lord Ivor Charles Spencer-Churchill was born on the 4th of October, 1898. With two sons produced, Consuelo had fulfilled the dynastic requirement. The Duke had heirs. The dukedom would continue. Beyond that, the couple had little reason to maintain even the pretense of affection. They lived increasingly separate lives. The Duke traveled, gambled, and pursued affairs. Consuelo devoted herself to social work and her children. She established reading rooms for servants, created schools for children on the estate, and worked to improve housing for tenant farmers and workers. She was loved by the local people for her efforts and her genuine concern for their welfare. The Duke viewed her social work as inappropriate, a betrayal of class distinctions that should be maintained. Consuelo ignored him. In 1906, after 11 years of marriage, Consuelo and the Duke formally separated. She would leave Blenheim. The palace she had saved would remain. The divorce would not be finalized until 1921, when the Catholic Church granted an annulment on grounds that Consuelo had been coerced into the marriage. Consuelo's testimony to the church described her mother's threats and her own feeling that she had no choice but to consent. The annulment effectively declared that the marriage had never been valid, that Consuelo had been forced into it against her will. She was free. But the palace her money had rescued stood restored. The £2.5 million had saved Blenheim from collapse. The roof had been completely restored. Electrical wiring had been installed throughout the palace. Modern plumbing and bathrooms had been added. Central heating, at least in sections of the building, made it marginally more comfortable. The stone had been cleaned and repaired. The grounds had been maintained. Staff wages had been paid. The Ninth Duke had used Consuelo's money exactly as intended, preserving the palace and ensuring it would survive another generation. The human cost of that preservation was a young woman forced into marriage, crying through her own wedding, spending 11 years in misery at a palace she never wanted to inhabit. The palace stood restored. Its roof no longer leaked. Its walls no longer crumbled. But the woman whose money had rescued it lived there like a prisoner in a gilded cell. Chapter 9. Consuelo's Legacy Beyond the Money. When Consuelo Vanderbilt left Blenheim Palace in 1906, she left behind more than an unhappy marriage. She left schools she had founded, reading rooms she had created, improved housing she had fought for, and a community that appreciated her efforts. Consuelo's money had saved the building, but her conscience had tried to save the people who lived around it. The Ninth Duke had viewed his wife's social reform efforts with suspicion and disapproval. English aristocracy maintained its position partly through clear separation from the lower classes. A duchess who involved herself in improving conditions for servants and tenant farmers was crossing boundaries that should remain fixed. Consuelo disagreed. She had been raised in America where new wealth coexisted with older money in ways that eroded rigid class distinctions. She believed that privilege carried obligations, that those who possessed wealth should use some portion of it to improve conditions for those who lacked it. She established reading rooms where servants could access books and newspapers. She created schools where estate children could receive education beyond basic literacy. She worked to improve housing for families living on Blenheim's lands, arguing that decent living conditions produced healthier, more productive workers. The local population loved her for these efforts. They recognized that the Duchess, unlike the Duke, genuinely cared about their welfare. When she left Blenheim in 1906, many expressed regret that she would no longer be there to advocate for them. After the separation, Consuelo returned to England periodically, but lived primarily in London and France. She remained involved with her sons, who stayed with their father at Blenheim. In 1921, she remarried Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and textile heir. This marriage was what her first marriage had not been, a partnership based on affection and mutual respect. She and Balsan lived in France for much of their marriage. She continued her charitable work supporting causes related to education and child welfare. She remained connected to the Churchill family, particularly to Winston Churchill, her husband's cousin, who had been born at Blenheim in 1874. During the years Consuelo lived at Blenheim, the Ninth Duke used her money for more than just essential repairs. Between 1925 and 1930, he hired Achille Duchesne, a French landscape architect, to create elaborate water terraces on the grounds. The project cost approximately £50,000 and created formal gardens in the French Beaux-Arts style with fountains, statuary, and geometric parterres. The terraces were beautiful, but represented exactly the kind of expensive decorative project that Sarah Churchill would have despised, and that consumed money better spent on essential maintenance. The Ninth Duke also created the Italian garden with Consuelo's input during the years she lived at Blenheim. This formal garden featured statuary imported from Italy, box hedges and gravel paths arranged in classical patterns. Unlike the water terraces, which were created after Consuelo left, the Italian garden represented one of the few collaborative projects between the Duke and Duchess, a space where her preferences influenced the final design. The Ninth Duke died in 1934. His elder son John became the 10th Duke of Marlborough at age 37. John had been raised at Blenheim, educated at Eton and Cambridge, and prepared to inherit the dukedom. What he inherited along with the title was another financial crisis. Death duties on the Ninth Duke's estate were substantial. The 10th Duke faced the same problem every duke since the first had confronted. Blenheim cost more to maintain than it generated in income. The agricultural depression that had devastated the 8th Duke's finances had not resolved. World War II would cause additional damage and deferred maintenance. By 1950, the 10th Duke faced a decision. He could continue struggling to maintain Blenheim as a private residence using inadequate income, or he could do something unprecedented. He could open Blenheim Palace to the public as a tourist attraction. The decision was controversial. English aristocracy did not open their homes to paying visitors. Doing so seemed like admitting defeat, acknowledging that the family could no longer maintain its heritage without commercial exploitation. But the alternative was losing Blenheim entirely. In 1950, Blenheim Palace opened to the public for the first time. Admission was 2 shillings and sixpence. Visitors could tour selected staterooms and walk the grounds. The response exceeded expectations. People wanted to see inside one of England's grandest palaces. They wanted to walk where Churchill had been born, see the room where he proposed to his wife, view the art collection and painted ceilings. Tourism generated income that agricultural rents no longer provided. Consuelo lived to see Blenheim open to the public. She died on the 6th of December, 1964. At age 87, she had outlived the Ninth Duke by 30 years and Jacques Balsan by 10 years. In 1953, she had published her autobiography, Quote 2, which became a bestseller. The book described her forced marriage, her years at Blenheim, and her eventual escape. She wrote that she had been coerced, that her mother's emotional manipulation had left her feeling she had no choice but to marry the Duke. She described the marriage as unhappy and Blenheim as cold, damp, and uncomfortable. But she also expressed pride in her sons and satisfaction that her money had saved the palace. Her assessment was clear-eyed. She had been forced into marriage by a domineering mother and a duke desperate for money. The arrangement had saved Blenheim, but had cost her 11 years of unhappiness. Whether that trade was worthwhile, only she could judge. She judged it harshly, but acknowledged the outcome. The palace her money had saved was now a business. Chapter 10. Commercialization and Controversy. The 10th Duke of Marlborough's decision to open Blenheim to the public in 1950 marked a fundamental transformation. The palace, built to house a dynasty and celebrate military glory, had become a commercial operation dependent on ticket sales. For aristocratic circles, the decision represented a form of surrender, an acknowledgement that traditional sources of wealth could no longer sustain historic properties. But for Blenheim, the decision was survival. Tourism generated revenue that made continued operation possible. The early years of public access were modest. Visitors could tour several staterooms and walk the grounds. A small tea room served refreshments. A gift shop sold postcards and guidebooks. The family maintained private apartments in the East Wing, completely separated from public areas. The number of visitors grew steadily through the 1950s and 60s as car ownership increased and domestic tourism expanded. By the early 1970s, Blenheim was receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. In 1973, the 10th Duke created a dedicated exhibition celebrating Winston Churchill, who had been born at Blenheim on the 30th of November, 1874. The Churchill exhibition occupied multiple rooms and displayed personal papers, paintings Churchill had created, war memorabilia, and artifacts from his political career. The exhibition attracted international tourists, particularly Americans, who wanted to see the birthplace of the wartime prime minister, who had led Britain through World War II. Some criticized the exhibition as inappropriate, arguing that Blenheim should remain focused on the Marlborough dukes rather than a cousin who happened to be born there. The 10th Duke defended the decision as practical. Churchill's fame brought visitors. Visitors brought revenue. Revenue paid for maintenance. The 11th Duke of Marlborough, John George Vanderbilt, Henry Spencer-Churchill, inherited the dukedom in 1972 when his father died. He was 46 years old, married to Susan Hornby, and determined to expand Blenheim's commercial operations far beyond his father's modest beginning. The 11th Duke understood that Blenheim's survival depended entirely on its ability to generate income. Agricultural rents contributed little. The family had no industrial holdings or significant investments. The palace itself was the only asset capable of producing revenue, and maximizing that revenue required treating Blenheim as a business rather than a heritage site that happened to admit tourists. During the 11th Duke's tenure from 1972 to 2014, Blenheim transformed from a tourist attraction to a fully commercialized operation. The events business expanded dramatically. Weddings were permitted in the palace and grounds, with couples paying substantial fees to hold ceremonies and receptions in staterooms. Corporate events and conferences were booked throughout the year, with companies using Blenheim as a venue for product launches, meetings, and entertainment. The palace became a filming location, generating significant income from movie and television productions that paid to use the buildings and grounds as backdrops. Concerts and festivals were held in the park, including rock concerts that drew thousands of attendees and generated complaints from neighbors about noise and traffic. An adventure playground was constructed to attract families with children. Catering operations expanded with restaurants and cafes serving thousands of meals daily during peak season. Retail operations grew to include multiple gift shops selling everything from postcards to expensive reproductions of palace furnishings. The transformation was controversial. Preservation groups argued that commercialization was degrading Blenheim's historic character. The palace, built to glorify a military hero, was being treated as a theme park. Rock concerts on the grounds seemed particularly inappropriate. Local residents complained about traffic, parking problems, and the constant flow of tourists through the area. Some accused the 11th Duke of prioritizing profit over preservation, of treating a UNESCO World Heritage Site as a commercial property to be exploited rather than a historic treasure to be protected. The 11th Duke responded that commercialization was not a choice, but a necessity. Blenheim received no government funding. UNESCO designation brought prestige but no money. Historic England provided small grants for specific restoration projects, but these covered only a fraction of annual maintenance costs. The palace required millions of pounds annually just to prevent deterioration. Roofs needed replacement. New stone facades needed cleaning and repair. Electrical and plumbing systems needed updating. Security systems needed installation. Fire suppression systems were required by law. Every improvement cost money that could only come from commercial operations. Without tourism revenue, events income, filming fees, and retail sales, Blenheim would collapse. The 11th Duke argued that he was not choosing between preservation and commercialization. He was choosing between commercialization and demolition. Critics could argue for purity, but unless they were prepared to provide the millions required annually, their arguments were irrelevant. Major restoration work proceeded throughout the 11th Duke's tenure. Roof sections were replaced at enormous cost. Stone cleaning removed centuries of accumulated dirt and pollution from facades. Interior restorations refreshed staterooms and repaired damaged decorative elements. The work was never completed because the scale of needed repairs always exceeded available funds. Blenheim existed in a state of perpetual restoration, with one section being repaired while another waited for attention. In 1987, UNESCO designated Blenheim Palace and its park as a World Heritage Site, recognizing its outstanding universal value as an example of English Baroque architecture and landscape design. The designation brought international recognition, but, as the Duke noted repeatedly, not a single pound of funding. When the 11th Duke died in 2014 at age 88, he left behind a palace that was surviving through commercialization, but remained perpetually on the edge of financial crisis. His son inherited the title, the palace, and the same impossible arithmetic that had haunted every duke since the first. Chapter 11. The Porsche Problem. Charles James Spencer-Churchill became the 12th Duke of Marlborough in 2014 when his father died. He was 59 years old, married to Edla Griffiths, and the father of 4 children, including George, Marquess of Blandford, who would eventually inherit the dukedom. The 12th Duke inherited a palace that was famous, profitable by historical standards, and perpetually underfunded. Blenheim received more than 500,000 visitors annually. Admission prices ranged from £34 to £39 for adults, depending on season and what sections visitors wanted to see. Events, weddings, filming fees, and retail operations generated additional millions. Total annual revenue exceeded £12 to £16 million, according to industry estimates, but costs consumed nearly all of that. Staff wages for 200 to 250 permanent employees cost £4 to £5 million annually. Maintenance and repairs required £3 to £4 million. Utilities, insurance, security, marketing, and operational expenses consumed millions more. The surplus available for major restoration work was minimal, typically £2 to £4 million annually, and major restoration work required tens of millions. Historic England estimated that Blenheim needed approximately £40 million in restoration work that had been deferred due to lack of funding. The roof needed sections replaced. Stone facades needed comprehensive repair. Climate control systems needed installation to protect art and furnishings. Fire suppression systems needed upgrading. Accessibility improvements were required to comply with modern regulations. The list was endless and the costs overwhelming. The 12th Duke faced the same reality every duke had faced since the first. The palace cost more than it generated. Unlike his ancestors, he could not sell land to raise capital because most of the estate was entailed. He could not reduce staff significantly because the palace required constant maintenance and tourism operations demanded workers. He could not raise admission prices without reducing visitor numbers. He could not cut costs without accelerating deterioration. He was trapped in an equation with no solution. In 2017, the Duke's personal financial pressure became public in the most embarrassing way possible. Porsche Financial Services sued the Duke for £96,000 in unpaid bills related to luxury car leases or purchases. The exact details of the debt were not disclosed, but the core fact was undeniable. The Duke of Marlborough, whose family palace generated millions in annual revenue, had failed to pay bills for expensive cars. The lawsuit became international news. Every major British newspaper covered the story. Headlines emphasized the irony. Aristocrat sued for unpaid bills. Duke cannot pay Porsche. Blenheim owner in debt for luxury cars. The publicity was devastating. The Duke settled the case out of court with terms kept confidential. But the damage to his reputation was permanent. The incident revealed what the Duke and his family had always understood, but preferred to keep private. Operating Blenheim left no room for personal luxuries. The millions generated by tourism did not translate into personal wealth for the Duke. Nearly every pound was consumed by maintenance, staff wages, and operations. What remained was insufficient to fund needed restoration work and certainly insufficient to support the lifestyle people imagined the Duke of Marlborough enjoyed. The Porsche lawsuit symbolized a larger truth about aristocratic decline. Titles meant nothing without wealth to support them. The Duke of Marlborough occupied one of the most prestigious positions in English society. But that position came with a palace that functioned as a financial burden rather than an asset. He could not sell it because it was entailed, and because doing so would mean acknowledging the family's 300-year struggle to maintain Blenheim had ended in failure. He could not afford to properly maintain it because the costs exceeded revenue. He survived by extracting maximum commercial value from the property, while hoping that nothing catastrophic occurred that would require expenditures beyond his capacity to fund. The COVID-19 pandemic provided exactly that catastrophe. In March of 2020, governments across the world struggled to contain the virus and issued stay-at-home orders. Blenheim Palace closed to the public on the 17th of March 2020 for the first time in its history. Not during the World Wars, not during the Great Depression, not during any previous crisis had Blenheim completely ceased operations. The closure lasted 4 months. During that time, revenue stopped completely while costs continued. Staff were furloughed but still required some payment. The palace still needed heating, security, and basic maintenance. The grounds still required care. When Blenheim reopened in July of 2020, it faced a transformed world. International tourism had collapsed, events had been canceled, social distancing requirements reduced capacity. The few visitors who came could not generate sufficient revenue to cover costs. The palace lost millions in 2020 and 2021. Government support programs provided some relief, but the losses were substantial, and recovery would take years. The pandemic demonstrated the palace's vulnerability. A crisis that stopped tourism for a few months threatened the entire operation. The financial model that had sustained Blenheim since 1950 depended on continuous revenue from visitors, events, and commercial operations. Any interruption of that revenue flow endangered the palace's survival. By 2023, visitor numbers had recovered to near pre-pandemic levels. The palace remained open, events resumed, and revenue returned to previous levels. But the experience revealed how precarious Blenheim's finances remained. The palace that Consuelo Vanderbilt's millions had saved in 1895, that had been open to the public in 1950, that generated millions annually, remained one crisis away from disaster. The question facing the 12th Duke was the same question every duke had faced since 1705. How do you preserve something that was designed to bankrupt you? Chapter 12. Survival Without Redemption. Walk through Blenheim Palace today, and the stone still glows in afternoon light. The Great Hall rises 67 feet to a painted ceiling, depicting the first Duke of Marlborough kneeling before Britannia. The staterooms display tapestries woven in Brussels, depicting the Duke's military victories. The long library stretches 180 feet, lined with 10,000 volumes. The saloon opens to views across the Italian garden and the Great Lake, created by Capability Brown. Visitors photograph Vanbrugh's Grand Bridge, perfectly proportioned to the water it crosses. The Churchill exhibition displays personal papers, paintings, and memorabilia from the wartime Prime Minister, born in the Green Writing Room on the 30th of November, 1874. 500,000 to 600,000 people visit Blenheim annually, paying £34 to £39 for admission. They tour 18 rooms open to the public out of approximately 200 total. They walk 2,100 acres of parkland. They eat lunch in the Orangery restaurant, purchase souvenirs in multiple gift shops, and photograph the facades. The stone changes with the light, warm gold in sunshine, somber gray in rain. The 12th Duke and his family live in approximately 30 rooms in the private wing, completely separated from public areas. They have their own entrance, their own gardens, and as much privacy as one can maintain while living in a building visited by more than 500,000 tourists annually. The Duke is 70 years old. His son George, Marquess of Blandford, is 33 and will eventually inherit the dukedom, the palace, and the financial crisis that comes with both. When the current Duke dies, the estate will owe substantial death duties. How the family will pay those duties without selling parts of the property or collection remains unclear. The cycle that began in 1722 when the first Duke died leaving debts will continue. Each generation inherits the palace and the burden. Staff who work at Blenheim today number approximately 200 to 250 permanent employees, with additional seasonal workers during peak visitor season. They maintain the building, operate tourism services, manage events, work in retail and catering, and keep the grounds immaculate. Most joined after the millennium and know the palace's history and outline, but did not live through the crises of previous decades. For them, Blenheim is a workplace that happens to be historically significant. The mythology exists separately from their daily experience of changing linens, serving meals, and mowing lawns. Recent restoration work has addressed urgent needs while leaving the £40 million backlog largely untouched. In 2024, a £2 million project restored the water terraces, repairing fountains, cleaning stonework, and conserving statuary. Heritage Lottery Fund grants and Historic England contributions covered portions of the cost. Ongoing roof restoration continues in sections, a perpetual process that will never be completed, because by the time one section is finished, another requires attention. Blenheim has been granted every possible preservation designation. It is Grade 1 listed, the highest level of protection for historic buildings in England. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1987 as Blenheim Palace and Park. It is registered as a Grade 1 park and garden by Historic England. These designations bring prestige and impose restrictions, but provide no funding. The Duke cannot alter the building without government approval. He cannot develop the land, he cannot demolish sections or significantly change the character of the palace, but the government that restricts his options provides no money to help maintain what it insists must be preserved. The Duke has refused to transfer Blenheim to the National Trust, the organization that manages many of England's historic properties. National Trust ownership would relieve the family of financial burden, but would also end 300 years of family stewardship. The Duke prefers to maintain private ownership despite the costs, believing that the family connection to the palace matters. Whether his son will make the same choice remains uncertain. The building itself bears witness to 3 centuries of ambition, desperation, and compromise. The limestone still dominates the Oxfordshire landscape. The triumphal arch entrance still announces military victory. The Grand Bridge still crosses Brown's Great Lake. The staterooms still display the tapestries celebrating battles fought more than 300 years ago. Tourists still photograph Vanbrugh's theatrical facade and share images on social media. For visitors, Blenheim is a destination, a place to spend an afternoon, a setting for photographs. They walk where John Churchill walked, where Sarah Churchill fought with architects, where Consuelo Vanderbilt lived in misery, where Winston Churchill was born. They admire the scale, appreciate the architecture, and leave after a few hours having experienced something impressive without understanding the cost of maintaining it. But Blenheim Palace was built to house a dynasty and establish a legacy. Instead, it bankrupted a war hero, required completion by a widow who spent 2 decades fighting lawsuits, survived only through American industrial millions purchased with a young woman's freedom, and continues today by functioning as a commercial property, open to anyone who can afford admission. The palace stands as a monument to English aristocracy. What it monumentalizes is not power or glory, but the impossibility of sustaining either. Every duke who inherited Blenheim inherited a burden disguised as a treasure. The first duke spent his fortune completing what Parliament promised to pay for. The fourth duke transformed the grounds at enormous expense. The ninth duke traveled to America, explicitly to find a rich bride whose dowry would prevent collapse. The 10th Duke opened the palace to tourists, abandoning 3 centuries of privacy. The 11th Duke expanded commercialization to levels that shocked preservationists. The 12th Duke was sued by Porsche for unpaid bills. Every generation faced the same arithmetic. The palace costs more than it generates. Every generation found temporary solutions. Completion through personal bankruptcy, landscape transformation, forced marriage, commercialization. None of these solutions resolved the fundamental problem. They simply delayed the next crisis. The story of Blenheim Palace offers no inspirational lessons about perseverance or vision. What it offers is truth about the cost of monumentalizing power. Palaces do not sustain themselves. Someone always pays. Sometimes in money, sometimes in freedom, sometimes in happiness, sometimes in all 3. The Oxfordshire stone that glows in sunlight was purchased with John Churchill's fortune, completed with Sarah Churchill's fury, restored with Consuelo Vanderbilt's captivity and maintained today by a family who inherited a title worth nothing and a building worth everything but impossible to keep without selling pieces of its soul through commercialization. 320 years after the first stone was laid, Blenheim Palace still stands. That is not triumph, it is simply survival. And survival, as every duke who has lived there learned, is not the same as winning. Blenheim Palace is open to visitors year-round, except the 25th of December. Admission prices vary by season and what sections you wish to see. The Churchill exhibition is included with palace admission. The estate hosts weddings, conferences, and special events throughout the year. You can walk where Winston Churchill proposed to his wife Clementine at the Temple of Diana in the gardens. You can stand in the room where he was born. You can see the portrait John Singer's sergeant painted of the Ninth Duke, Consuelo Vanderbilt, and their two sons in 1905. The gift shops sell books about the family, the architecture, and Churchill. The restaurant serves lunch and tea. It is, by any measure, a successful commercial operation that employs hundreds, attracts tourists from across the world, and preserves a significant example of English Baroque architecture. But no amount of commercial success can resolve the central contradiction of Blenheim Palace. It was built as a gift and became a burden. It was meant to glorify a dynasty and instead nearly destroyed one. It was saved by a woman whose marriage to its owner was described by her as forced. And it survives today not through the aristocratic model it was built to embody, but by abandoning that model entirely. The Oxfordshire stone that glows in sunlight was purchased with fortunes, completed with bitterness, restored with captivity, and maintained through desperation. The building stands not because anyone found a perfect solution, but because desperate people kept finding temporary ones. Consuelo Vanderbilt's forced marriage bought a century. The 10th Duke's commercialization bought another half-century. What the 12th Duke's choices will buy remains uncertain. There is a palace in Oxfordshire. It has witnessed 3 centuries of ambition, desperation, and compromise. It stands because too many people sacrificed too much to let it fall. The palace endures, but endurance purchased at such cost is not redemption.